Alright, anatomist. We have one test down. Our next test is going to be over muscles and the cardiovascular system. So, of our muscles, we have three major types of muscle tissue. You have skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. And there's a couple things you can look at in these types of tissues to determine which one they are. So if we just look at skeletal real quick, you can see there's lots of these stripes in here. That's something called striations. So skeletal muscle is striated. You can also see lots of these dark purple things. These dark purple things are nuclei, and this is one muscle cell here, or a muscle fiber. And if you look, it has 1, 2, 3, 4 nuclei that we can see. And so your skeletal muscle is going to be multinucleated, meaning it just has more than one nuclei. Your skeletal muscle is also voluntary. When we talk about voluntary control of muscle, this is conscious control. So if you want to contract that muscle, you think about contracting it and then it contracts, which is different from this next group. Your smooth muscle is involuntary. So smooth muscle is the type of muscle that you find lining your blood vessels, lining your gastrointestinal tract or your intestines, and you can't think about contracting your intestines and have that happen because it is involuntary. It's not under conscious control. Something else you notice about smooth muscle is there's no banding pattern here. And so smooth muscle is non-striated. It's also mononucleated, meaning for each one of these nucleus, it is going to be for a single cell. These cells tend to be spindled shaped, or they're a little bit wider in the middle and then taper at the ends. It's really hard to see the outline of these individual cells in this type of slide. But each one of these nuclei has their own individual cell. The last type of muscle is cardiac. Cardiac is also involuntary. This is the type of the muscle that your heart is made out of. The only place you should find cardiac muscle is in the heart. You can't consciously make your heart beat faster or slower because, again, it is involuntary. It is striated, so if you look in here, you can see some of these bands, but you also see these darker bands along with them. These darker bands are something called intercalated disc that we'll talk about a lot more when we get to the cardiovascular system and how the heart beats. Cardiac is also mononucleated, so for each one of these dark purple nuclei, it is for an individual cell. You can see there's some white space in here because your cardiac muscle is also branched, and so it you can have it where it goes out to more than one cell. There's an asterisk here on mononucleated because sometimes there are two nuclei per cardiac cell, but more often than not, it's only one. So those are the three types of tissues. Your skeletal tissue, the only one that is voluntary. It has that striping pattern, and it has more than one nucleus per cell. Your smooth muscle, involuntary, does not have the striations. It's the only one that doesn't have those striations, and it's mononucleated. And then you have cardiac, which is involuntary, has the striping, and is mononucleated. Most of your weight, 40% of your body weight, comes from your skeletal muscle. Your smooth and cardiac combined only make up about 10% of your body weight. So a lot of your body weight is skeletal muscle. And what we're going to spend most of our time talking about in here is our skeletal muscle because we have a lot of it. So when we go to name skeletal muscles, there's a couple ways you can name it. You can name the muscles based on the location, so where you find it. You can name those skeletal muscles on the insertions and the origins. The insertion is going to be the bone that moves when you contract that muscle. So all your skeletal muscle, the major function of skeletal muscle is to get shorter or to contract. So when you contract that muscle, the bone that moves is the insertion. The one that doesn't move is the origin. We can also name it based on the shape or the type of movement that it does. So here we can see the location, frontalis muscle, or the frontal belly of the occipitofrontalis muscle, depending on how you want to talk about it. We're just going to call this the frontalis muscle. It's found on the frontal bone. Here you have the rectus femoris. Femoris, because it is found in the femoral region, or above that femur. For our insertion and origins, here we're looking at the sternocleidomastoid. The sterno is talking about the sternum. The cleido is talking about your clavicle. And then you have your insertion up here on the mastoid process. So sternocleidomastoid muscle. And then we have our shape. So this muscle right here is your deltoid. And it looks like a triangle. The Greek letter that looks like a triangle is delta. And so this muscle gets its name based on that shape, that deltoid or triangular shape. Another one would be like your trapezius, looks like a trapezoid. Something else that goes with this are some of these relative terms, like rectus. If we go back to this one, you have your rectus femoris. Rectus muscles are muscles that run longitudinally on the body. So muscles that run straight up and down. So this rectus femoris is a muscle that runs up and down in the femoral region. Transverse are going to be muscles that run side to side, like your transverse plane. Oblique muscles are muscles that run at a 45-degree angle. They can run down or they can run up, either way. If they're at a 45, they're oblique. And we have some other relative terms like brevis. If you have a muscle that is a brevis muscle, it is a short muscle, like you want to keep it brief. A longus muscle is going to be the opposite. It's going to be a long muscle. Maximus is a big muscle. Medius is a middle-sized muscle. And then minimus is a little bitty muscle. So there's lots of different ways we can name them based on shape, and they're telling you what that muscle looks like. But it can also tell you what that muscle does. So here we can see extensor digitorum longus. Extensor, it's going to extend the digits, digitorum, and it's long. So it's telling you what it looks like and what it does. Here you have flexor carpi radialis. Flexor, so it's going to flex carpi, talking about your carpal bones. So it's going to flex the wrist, and it's found along the radial bone, flexor carpi radialis. And then, of course, here you have flexor carpi ulnaris doing the same thing, flexing the wrist, but on the medial side, on that ulnar side. Here's another one, tibialis anterior. This is just telling you it is anterior to the tibial bone, or the tibia. So when you're going through learning these muscle names, a lot of the times it's going to tell you where it is, or what it looks like, what's its insertion and origin, or what it does, or any combination of that. So these muscle names, if you can learn them, is going to help you learn where they are and what they do. So what are our muscles made out of? Well, they're made out of cells, right? muscle cells. But if you look even deeper than that, you can see that they have a bunch of myofilaments. This can be actin and myosin, your thin filament and your thick filament. Together, these myofilaments make up something called a myofibril. So here you can see this myofibril made up of these individual filaments. Those myofibrils are then contained within a muscle fiber or a muscle cell. Those individual muscle fibers then get wrapped up into a muscle fascicle or a group of muscle cells. And then all those fascicles get wrapped up into the entire muscle. And so you have these little filaments that make a fibril. The fibrils make a fiber. The fibers make a fascicle. And the fascicles make up the entire muscle. Each one of these things, those fibers to fascicles to the entire muscle, are wrapped in insulators. Why does your muscle need insulators? Well, if you've taken physiology, you know that there's an electrical signal from a neuron that tells the muscle to contract. With this electrical activity, it's important to keep your cells, groups of cells, and muscles separated from each other. And so we have our insulators that do that. If we look at the individual muscle right here, your muscle fibers, so those individual cells, you're going to have an endomyosum. So you can see this endomyosum keeping this muscle fiber separate from this muscle fiber, separate from this muscle fiber. And then all those muscle fibers get wrapped up in that fascicle, which has its own perimyosum. So endomyosum, you can think of it, endo as an inside around the individual muscle fiber. Perimyosum, peri means next to, and so is going to be wrapping a group of muscle fibers into that fascicle. And then you have your epimyosum. Epi means on top of. Myosum's talking about that muscle, and so it is on top of, covering the entire muscle. And here you can see how that epimyosum has the fascia, which then becomes the tendon and attaches to the bone, and actually it attaches or becomes the periosteum of the bone. And so you have this really tight connection between the bone and the tendon of this muscle. So endomyosum around the individual muscle cells, perimyosum around the fascicles, epimyosum around the entire muscle. There's a lot of specific vocabulary that deals with muscle cells or muscle fibers because they're unique. They're different from a lot of your other cells. So they are electrically active. Their major function is to contract to get shorter, and that makes it really different from like a hepatocyte or a liver cell. And so we have some really specific vocabulary to deal with your muscle cells. So the first one is your muscle fiber, which is just a different name for a muscle cell. In skeletal muscle, the cells are really long. They're really long, so they look like fibers, right? And so a muscle cell, muscle fiber is the exact same thing. You also have the sarcoplasm. The sarcoplasm is the word for cytoplasm. So the cytoplasm inside a muscle cell is called the sarcoplasm. You also have the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is going to be a special type of smooth endoplasmic reticulum. Your sarcoplasmic reticulum is really good at releasing and reabsorbing calcium. which is important in muscle contraction. And then within that muscle fiber, you also have a sarcomere. The sarcomere is going to be the contractile unit of that fiber. So your fiber is going to have a bunch of these sarcomeres, and their job is to get shorter, and when they get shorter, that entire muscle cell or fiber gets shorter with it. And we'll talk more about the sarcomere when we get there in a bit. And anytime you hear myo, you should think muscle. So if it's myo anything, that's going to be dealing with your muscles. So the sarcomere, we talked about it just a little bit ago. It is the contractile unit of your skeletal muscle. It is made up of your myosin fiber, or those thick fibers, and your actin fibers, or your thin fibers. So looking here in this figure, this one right here is a bunch of myosin fibers all together, making your thick filament. And then right here you can see your actin fibers, or your thin filament, laying on top of them. And so as your muscle contracts, this myosin gets pulled over the top of, or this actin gets pulled over the top of this myosin, and these two Z discs get closer together, causing that contraction. So here again, you can see the M line of your myosin. Here's the Z disc or Z line with your actin attached to it. If you look here again, you can see there's a couple different bands. You have this A band right here where you find the myosin. The A band is the dark band. So if we look back at our skeletal muscle slide, you can see there's dark and light bands all throughout here. These dark bands are going to be where you find that myosin. The light bands are where you're going to find only actin. There is some actin that is laying over the top of the myosin, so the myosin heads can grab it and pull it. This is all stuff you'll learn or have learned in physiology. So here's your actin, a better figure of your actin. You can see there's the active sites where your myosin heads are going to actually bind. But we have regulatory proteins that stop myosin from binding when it's not the right time. And so you have troponin and tropomyosin. And what tropomyosin does is it lays over these active sites to stop those myosin heads from binding. Troponin makes sure that tropomyosin is in the right position. And so with troponin and tropomyosin here, these myosin heads cannot bind. When we look at our muscle fiber arrangement, there's a couple different ways it can be arranged. It could be fusiform, where you have a tendon at one end and a tendon at the other end, and then the belly of a muscle. This is looking at your biceps brachii muscle. So when you contract that muscle, this area right here expands, so it gets bigger. So if you want to flex your bicep, those tendons stay the same length. They really don't stretch or shrink too much. And so what happens is the belly right here of that muscle expands out. A lot of your glamour muscles are going to be fusiform muscles. We also have pinnate muscles where you have tendons running through the muscle. So if you take a cross section here, you can see 1, 2, 3 tendons running through this deltoid muscle. On those pinnate muscles, they can be unipinnate, where you have it running down just one edge, like your extensor digitorum muscle here. Bipinnate, where it runs down the middle. Or multipinnate, where you have more than one tendon. So your bipinnate pulls to the middle, and then your multipinnate in various directions. But that's not the only arrangements we have either. We also have parallel muscles. So here you can see the sartorius muscle runs from the outside of the hip to the inside of the knee. is a parallel muscle. All these fibers are running in the exact same direction. You can have convergent or triangular muscles. This is your pectoralis major. You can see how all these fibers converge to one point. Your tricep is kind of like this, but it's multi-convergent. So you have points that go up, across, and down. They can be circular, like your orbicularis oris or your orbicularis oculi. And then here you can see your pinnates and fusiforms. So there's a lot of different ways that these muscle fibers can arrange. Just briefly, we're going to talk about the neuromuscular junction. And so this is a motor neuron coming from the central nervous system, coming to work on these individual muscle fibers. And you can see the axon from this motor neuron reaches out and talks to more than just one fiber. So all the muscle fibers that one motor neuron talks to is called the motor unit. And out here you can see how this axon kind of like branches out. That forms the motor end plate. So neurotransmitters will be released from here to bind the muscle cell and set off a cascade of sodium gates opening and all this stuff that was covered or will be covered in physiology. And that's just a brief overview of your skeletal muscles, over muscles in general. Next time we are going to get to the individual muscles that you need to know for this course.